Hello and welcome to another episode of the Chinese History Podcast. I'm Yiming Ha. Today we welcome two guests, Bruce Rusk, a professor of Asian Studies, and Christopher Rea, professor of Chinese Literature, both at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. They recently completed the translation of a book titled More Swindles from the Late Ming, Sex, Scams, and Sorcery, originally published in the Late Ming period by Zhang Yingyu. And they join us today to discuss this translation. So, Professor Rusk and Professor Rea, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So let's start off with the title of the book. It's More Swindles from the Late Ming, Sex, Scams, and Sorcery, which quite frankly sounds a bit scandalous. So can you start off by explaining to us what this book is about?
Sure. Well, it's the second part of a translation of a collection of stories from the early 17th century. And it is scandalous. Stories themselves involve a lot of scandals as well as scams that are, for the most part, fictional, that are set in the world of Late Ming China. And Zhang Yingyu is the author, or at least the compiler, of this collection of stories. And they are mostly stories about commercial swindles or ordinary crimes, although some are bigger crimes. We can talk about some of the national level political scandals that a couple of the stories involve, but most of them are what you might consider petty crimes, but they give a lot of insight into the way things worked in the society of Late Ming China.
The book is about 400 years old, and it's very much interested in helping us understand how con men operate, how con artists, travel throughout the realm, where they can be found, how they act. And all of the stories, there are about 84 stories in the collection, and they're all presented as true crime. So we get a name or the names of characters, their specific places, and then they tell us what happened. And we typically know from the get-go who the criminal is and who the victim is, or victims. And it's more about how are they going to do it? How are they going to perpetrate this fraud or scam or swindle? And it's meant to be kind of a cautionary tale or set of cautionary tales, especially for traveling business people. So for the man on the road who's away from home. And the vision of Late Ming society is extremely negative. It does show a lot of prosperity, but it also shows a lot of criminality, kind of riding the coattails of that prosperity and trying to siphon some of it away.
Yeah, so since you brought up the issue of Late Ming society, I think we should talk a little bit more about that. So what exactly was going on in the Late Ming for a book like this to exist and to circulate?
Well, there are a couple of things. One is this background of prosperity, that trade has taken off. Some people, historians, will attribute that in part to the influx of silver coming ultimately from the Americas, being mined by the Spanish and exported through Manila and kind of lubricating the wheels of commerce. But also there's relative peace leading to the prosperity brought by specialization, by people moving goods across long distances. Mostly these stories are set in the South, and so a lot of the travel is by water. So there's a lot of boats, people moving large quantities of goods through canals, rivers, and lakes, and people getting quite rich off of this kind of trade, but also people preying on it, people taking advantage of these people moving around with large crates of valuable material, especially silver. For a book like this to exist, of course, there also has to be a readership. And part of what people did with their money was get educated, whether it was for the exams to become an official or at least get the status of a degree, or just for basic literacy. And so it's also a period in which you see a lot of accessible books for ordinary people. Things like stories, plays that are read by a wide readership, that are printed mostly with woodblock printing and widely disseminated, often illustrated, that became bestsellers. And this may not have been one of the very top bestsellers, but it was definitely aiming at the same kind of market as those other books that circulated and were read not just by scholars, but by ordinary people who probably couldn't have read the Confucian classics and other elite kinds of texts. But this is in a fairly simple, classical, but vernacular inflected Chinese.
So it's a pretty lively collection. As Bruce said, it's all written in classical Chinese. It's not super elusive. It talks about the Book of Changes occasionally to make a moral point. But I'd say it's a pretty accessible work. And we got a sense from the process of translation. We looked at a few copies from the Ming from the 17th century. We looked at modern editions. We discovered that the book, it didn't circulate a lot in China, as far as we can tell, in like the Qing dynasty. We don't have a lot of extant editions. It did travel to Japan, and it had a readership there. And there's been a flurry of interest in recent decades in this book. And you have new editions coming out. You have Baihua, or vernacular Chinese translations of it. But when you go back and look at the original text, there's lots of errors. There are lots of copyist errors. There are mistakes. The table of contents don't match the contents in a lot of places. And so it was a real fun kind of piece of detective work and working through this to see what the story was trying to say and see what errors might have slipped in.
So you did mention that this book also, it's a cautionary tale, right? So there's a bit of an educational value to it as well. But I'm also curious about this readership in Japan. Do we know if the Japanese read it for fun or if they were also taking this as a cautionary tale?
It's hard to know, probably for fun, although one copy that survives in Japan was in the collection of a prominent early Tokugawa period Confucian scholar, Hayashi Razan, and seems to have some notes in his own hand. So it was part of the wider practice of reading the full range of material that people in Japan could get access to from Ming China, including not only scholarly works, but also vernacular fiction. And there are some translations into Japanese from the Tokugawa period. So they were probably reading it for fun because there wouldn't be so much need necessarily for defending themselves against Ming swindlers.
Right. If you're in Japan, you're not going to be going to Fujian province and getting duped at the market. And so I think one important thing to remember is that the book, it has several titles. We called it the Book of Swindles because modern editions sometimes call it the Pian Jing, like the classic of swindles or the Book of Swindles, kind of like the Shi Jing, right, the book of poetry. But it presents an imaginary, it's a work of literature. So it presents an imaginary image of the Ming Dynasty, which is quite heterogeneous. And again, it's mostly negative. But one of the longer titles of the book is Jianghu Lilan Du Pian Xin Shu. So it's a new book for foiling swindles based on worldly experience, like experience of the wide world of the Jianghu, the rivers and lakes. And as Bruce mentioned, there was indeed a lot of actual real life travel through rivers and lakes for commerce. But it's also an imaginary realm of travelers' tales that can be a little bit dubious. So even as presented as a lot of true crime, you can't validate most of this stuff. Yeah. And we don't know if these are actual people. There's some place names that are fictitious that don't even seem to be errors. It's almost like they were trying to make up a place name to protect the local inhabitants from this stupid town. So it does seem like there's a very strong entertainment element. And there's also plenty in there where there's no swindle per se, but it's just kind of a funny story, or there's a little bit of sex thrown in or something like that.
Do we know anything about the author? Because it would seem either, he would have experience with some of these swindles or he was just collecting the stories he's heard. So is there any information on who this guy is?
Virtually nothing, just name from the book itself and a mention in one preface or one header to the chapters that he supposedly is from Zhejiang, although the other prefaces refer to him as coming from Jianyang, which is the publishing center in Fujian province where the book was initially printed. We know a little bit more about the publishers who also published what were sometimes called daily use encyclopedias, and books of crime fiction, 公案小说, so stories where a magistrate solves a crime. So we get a sense of the milieu it came from, even if we don't know anything about the author himself, other than what we can glean from the book. We do get a sense that he was interested in the Book of Changes, the I Ching, because there's a few references to it in some of the notes that he adds at the end of stories. So he probably had some level of classical education. But whether he was himself a merchant, for example, or just in a merchant milieu, we can't really say.
But we do have, actually, most of what we know about him is just from his autobiographical writings within the Book of Swindles itself. And there's one preface dated 1617 that talks about him and praises him as a man who knew the world and has wise words for us. But after almost all of the stories, there's an author comment on the story where he says, wow, that was a brilliant swindle, or, you should have seen that one coming, where there's a moral judgment and often a kind of analysis or a post-mortem on this story. And sometimes Zhang does speak in his own voice and say, I would never have done that, or I heard this story from a friend, so I know it's true. But it's, he's essentially a cipher. We know very little about Zhang Yingyu.
So before we move on to kind of the technical aspect of translating this book, I was just wondering, is this book unique or are there others like it, these compilations of swindles and stories?
It's pretty much unique, and it's not a genre that ever took off, although it resembles the detective fiction that I mentioned, the 公案小说, in some ways. But in some ways, it's also a reversal of that, since in those stories, usually the crime is solved by a brilliant magistrate. Here, many of the crimes either are unresolved or are successful. And if they're solved, it's usually not by the official. Often there's a bumbling magistrate who fails to solve the crime and people resolve it on their own. So it's distinct in that way. There is some influence that we mentioned passing for certain stories where there is a plot, or in some cases, even actual characters, and the individuals involved seem to be known, either that there's a common source with a story that appears elsewhere, or somebody, for example, in the Qing or in Japan, copied or adapted the story that's in the Book of Swindles. But for the most part, it kind of stands on its own.
That's very interesting. I guess that makes sense why they will call it the Pianjing, right? The classic, if it's the only one in its kind. So let's talk a little bit about the translation process itself. What was it like, translating this book? What got you too interested in translating it? And were there any challenges with translating something like this?
Bruce knew about this collection first. I think he'd been translating some of it for one of his classes.
Yeah, I translated a few stories for a class, an undergraduate class many years ago, and realized that students really engaged, found the stories quite fun. And I'd done a handful of them. And then Chris and I talked about it and decided to start by translating about half the stories for the first volume. That went well, so we decided to do the rest for the second volume.
I had been drawn to this collection because I did one book, a kind of cultural history about comedy and laughter in early 20th century China, so late Qing and Republican period. And I discovered there were a lot of stories about tricksters, that this was like a major comic aesthetic. And so I became curious about antecedents. And there's one author in particular, I did a whole book on him called China's Chaplain, where his aesthetic was all about hoaxes. It's like every single story, the hoax is the main mechanism for comedy. And so when Bruce mentioned the Book of Swindles to me, I was like, I've got to read this thing. It just sounds absolutely fascinating. And that morphed into a different project called Stories of Chinese Deception, where I've been very curious about how people in China and elsewhere categorize deception. Like, if you take like the swindle or the hoax as a category, and then you try to give it a typology, how do people do that? And so, for example, in the Book of Swindles, there's a section called Poetry Swindles, 诗词片, right? Or poetry and lyric swindles. What on earth is that? Is that something that is disproportionately found in China versus elsewhere? And what does that mean? Like how does a poetry swindle play out? And so this book gives some answers to that, at least from the late Ming. But I think it's very interesting to put the Book of Swindles in a global context. So, for example, one thing that we discovered is you have books of swindles from other countries. I'll mention just a couple. One is The New Cheats of London Exposed, or The Frauds and Tricks of the Town, laid open to both sexes, being a guard against the iniquitous practices of that metropolis. That is the title of a book from around 1792, printed in London. And it had earlier editions about like the countryman's guide to London. So all you xiangxia lao, like all of you country rubes, when you come to the big bad city, these are the types of scams and swindles to watch out for. And you can find this elsewhere. And, Don Quixote has a lot of swindles and delusions in it. There was a book from the 19th century by P.T. Barnum, right, the famous showman, called Humbugs of the World, an account of humbugs, delusions, impositions, quackeries, deceits, and deceivers, generally and in all ages, from 1866. So back to your question about like genre, this does seem to be a thing. Like people around the world seem to collect swindle stories. And so I think the Book of Swindles is part of that tradition.
Interesting. Are there any swindles that kind of overlap, China, England, that kind of sound similar, or are they like completely different?
I would say a lot of the simple mechanics, the basic mechanics of the swindle, the distraction, for example, is a very common tactic. And one of the sources that we looked at was a early 20th century study by an American linguist called The Big Con that was based on interviews with con artists. And it was helpful in terms of thinking about the language for talking about the way swindlers work. And the North American con artists made a distinction between short cons and long cons. Short cons being ones that happen on site, you quickly fleece somebody out of their money. Long cons,
it's just whatever they're carrying, right?
Exactly, whatever they have in their pocket, you get from them. And I'd say the majority of the stories here are short cons in that sense. But the long con, where you set up a bigger, in some cases, something like a fake business and draw people in, so they have to go home, get all the money out of their bank account, and then you really take them for all they're worth, so to speak. There are some stories like that here as well. And those categories were definitely useful, but a lot of them involve simple distraction. Some of them we can barely call swindles because they're just basically beating someone up and taking their money. In one case, somebody is basically in a field relieving themselves. They've had to pull up their skirt to go to a place where there's no bathroom, and that's a perfect opportunity for somebody, a thief, to run up to them, take their coin purse and run off. That's
literally caught with their pants down.
Yes. And that's hardly a swindle in our sense, but it still falls into the same category for this book.
So I'd encourage people to like read the Book of Swindles and then go watch a film like American Hustle, in which there's a very clear big store, and you can compare them and you can see to what extent they're similar.
So, today, for most people, at least, when you want to translate something, you typically just put it into Google Translate, or nowadays we have AI. So most people probably aren't familiar with the process of translating pre-modern book from classical Chinese to English. So could you walk us through the process of translation? For instance, I know you mentioned that there were different editions of the book in China, Japan, in the Ming and modern periods. So for instance, like what's the importance of comparing these different editions of the same book versus just taking one and just translating that?
Well, first, we generally didn't rely on any kind of machine translation, simply because for classical Chinese, there isn't anything that's reliable enough, especially for this kind of fairly simple but still outdated kind of language.
But we would encourage everybody to go to Gutenberg.org, download the Gutenberg version of the Book of Swindles, plug it into Google Translate, and see what you get.
It's an interesting experiment.
It would be a fun experiment.
Yes. And the basic process was to read through it carefully, and we sort of divvied up the individual stories and then read each other's draft translations. The language was sometimes fairly straightforward, but sometimes there were words that we really puzzled over. And sometimes looking at multiple copies was helpful for the variation, simply for the fact that there was material in some copies and not in others. And so in order to get a complete vision of even the first edition, we had to look at multiple copies, since no single copy had everything in it. Some had the illustrations, but not the preface, for example. So you can't just look at and rely on one copy. There are modern editions, but while that can be helpful, for example, for looking at how one reader has punctuated the text, different readers will punctuate it differently, and no single one was going to be correct in every case. Likewise, looking at modern translations into standard Chinese, into Baihua, can be useful, but in some cases we disagreed with those translations. So you have to kind of look at all those different resources. Also look at, in some cases, specialized dictionaries. So there is some language that is specifically the Fujian dialect that was used in the area where the book was published and probably spoken by the author. And there's some terms that we really puzzled over until we looked them up in dialect dictionaries that told us what they meant in those specific cases. In some instances, though, we've had to really guess, because there are characters that are used in this book that do not appear in, as far as we know, in any other book anywhere. And so we could only guess from context. That was especially true in one section about the ways to identify fake silver. There was a problem in the Ming with all the silver we talked about flowing around, that people would counterfeit it. They would make ingots that would have a mix of other metals or have a lump, say, of iron in the middle. So it would look like an ingot of silver, but actually you'd only be getting, say, half the silver you thought you were getting. And there was a whole technical language for talking about things like that. And that really hadn't been studied. And some of the terms that appear here are simply not in any dictionary. And so only by guessing from the context could we make sense of it. And sometimes it is a guess, but we did our best with that.
Yeah, there's one story that will teach you how to be an alchemist if you want to create silver or fake silver. And I feel like translation does involve a little bit of alchemy itself. And we tried to turn, a very difficult text in some ways, or sometimes occasionally puzzling text, into something that's fun and readable and entertaining. Obviously, we live in an age where, con artists in charge is a big issue. But I think that you want to draw on, like as a translator, you want to draw on all resources available and judge which ones are the most useful. So we did look at several Ming copies, but just to give one example, like ctext.org, a fantastic research resource, great for individual character searching and quick reference, used widely by scholars of pre-modern China. The copy of the Book of Swindles that you find there is based on a Harvard copy, which is missing a story. And so if you relied on that, or even if you relied on the printed copies that are widely distributed of the Harvard one, you will be missing a story from the Book of Swindles. And so it's really important to be thorough and exhaustive. And so we literally have had days where we're just like going through the punctuation and commas, comma by damn comma, to make sure we've got it right. So it was fun. It was pretty exhaustive, but yeah, I think fun from start to finish.
Yeah, definitely. It's a lot more complicated than it sounds. But also, it raises an interesting questions about the history of the book in China, like why the certain editions have stuff that other editions don't. I don't know if it's appropriate for this interview, but something to think about.
Well, you can read, and it's really interesting. There are a couple stories which do appear in later works. So the Book of Swindles version is one of the earlier versions. There's one about a virtuous widow. Her husband is murdered by a neighbor, and then the neighbor marries her. And then like 20 years later, she discovers about the murder because he finally confesses. It's a story involving a frog, which I won't tell you all the details of, But there are several later versions of that. It was adapted into plays, it was adapted into other stories, and it seems to have been popular. And so this is like one, so you can read the book for that type of genealogy. It's also a really fascinating book if you're interested in family relations, and especially how they can go bad for women. So there are a lot of women who are taken advantage of, their husbands die, or their father-in-law prostitutes them out for some scam he's got going because he's a crime boss. And so part of our introduction to this volume, More Swindles from the Late Ming, we try to talk about some of those background contexts and like what would be a plausible scenario for a woman whose husband has died or who is contemplating remarriage, who might make a good partner and who might not.
So this is the second volume, right? You translated the first volume several years ago. It's titled The Book of Swindles, Selections from a Late Ming Collection. Why was there a decision to cut it in half? And did you just decide to translate the first half, or did you pick and choose which stories to translate first and which stories to save for later?
Well, as Chris mentioned, there are categories of swindle, and the book is arranged into these headings. And we, in the first volume, covered at least one story from each of, I think it was 24 types of stories. So we wanted to make sure that we covered that range. But for practical purposes, we decided it would be too much, it would make too thick a book to have all of the stories in a single volume. So we translated just over half in the first volume and heard from colleagues that it was well received. People were signing in their classes. So we thought it would be a good idea to do the rest. So we basically covered the rest in the second volume and also added some of these issues in an introduction. And we decided to add an explanation of the 4 images that appear at the heads of the 4 volumes of the original publication.
Do you think translating the second volume was substantially different than the first one? Or was there more work involved, or was it more or less similar?
Yeah, we talk about that a little bit in the introduction to the second volume about the selection process. So for the first volume, we did choose some of our favorite stories, or the ones we thought had the most intrinsic interest. We did want to have some representation of each type of swindle in there. We also excluded some things that are maybe a bit more prurient interest. And so like all of the dregs, all of like the worst of the worst, all the child abuse, like there's a lot more sex, there's a lot more, actually, although it was the publisher's decision to put sex before scams in the subtitle. That was not our decision. So they wanted to ratchet that up. But there's a lot more about sorcerers and kind of supernatural scammers in the second part. But the division is a little bit arbitrary. So like if you want the full effect, you do have to read the 2 volumes together, section by section. But I think it's actually okay, because the organizational logic of the original is also a little bit arbitrary. You can read stories out of sequence and decide which are the most interesting. But there are a few standout stories in the second volume. The one that Bruce mentioned, where they append like an entire pamphlet that Zhang Yingyu says he came across about how to distinguish silver. That's a standout story. It has one of the longest comments there. The one I mentioned about the frog, that doesn't have a comment at the end, but that I think too is one of the most popular stories that appear in the collection. And there are several others involving devious monks. So essentially, if you're a woman of good household, never go to a Buddhist monastery. Stay away from monks. Let that be a lesson to you all.
Also, if you're a man.
Also, if you're a man, sorry.
Do you think that's just, a Confucian reaction against Buddhism, or is there actually something going on with Buddhism during this period?
There's definitely an element of, we might call it prejudice against Buddhism in the book.
A lot of stereotypes.
Yes. And this stereotype was quite widespread, that Buddhist monasteries were dangerous places, that
full of idlers,
full of lustful monks who, in some cases, there's a story about monks who essentially have open secret wives, where they share a wife with a tenant farmer of land they own, and go back and forth between married and monastic life freely. So there's certainly this sense that monks are deceptive, although it's a little bit attenuated by occasional citations where the author actually does use either quotations or the kind of language that appears in Chan, so Zen Buddhist texts, in a kind of positive way. And the illustrations that appear at the heads of the chapters, the last one that appears at the last volume is accompanied by a brief text that is inspired by the Platform Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch. So there's a slightly mixed attitude towards Buddhism. It was part of the elite culture of the time. So an educated person would be able to refer to Buddhist texts in a positive way, but the actual people, the Buddhists themselves, are seen as dangerous, deceptive, and not to be trusted.
And there's the one other outstanding story near the end of the collection that involves threatening the entire empire, involves Buddhist monks, where you essentially have this idle millionaire who falls under the sway of Buddhists who convince him that to see in magic reflections in water that show him essentially as emperor. And so it's this almost Macbeth-like delusion of grandeur that he falls for and launch a rebellion. And there's a lot of dialogue in there about past rebellions, mostly failed. But yeah, the Buddhists are kind of the catalyst. And the interesting thing for a modern is that Zhang Yingyu doesn't treat the magic as being like fake magic. He believes that the magic is real, or at least he presents it as real. He just says, watch out that people will use magic for the wrong reasons. So it's not like magic doesn't exist or pills of immortality don't exist. It's just they can be misused by unscrupulous Buddhists or Taoists sometimes too.
Wow, that's very interesting. Any favorite stories that you have from these two collections?
One that comes to mind for me is a fairly simple one. It involves a long con in that it's centered around a monk, again, one of these dangerous Buddhists, who happens to look exactly like the guardian deity statue in a temple. And he is basically sent by the abbot of the monastery to trick a rich man into donating a huge fortune to endow the temple. So he goes, visits this rich man, asks for a donation. The man is skeptical, but he comes later to visit the monastery. And when he sees the statue, who looks exactly like the monk who had visited him, the abbot says, oh no, we never sent anyone to solicit donations. And so the idea is that it was the statue who got up and sought out the rich man. And so they're playing with this credulity about the possibility of magic. But in this case, there is no divine intervention. It's purely a trick. In this case, it's a little ambiguous again, because the money is donated to the temple under false pretenses, but it, for the most part, is going to be used to rebuild the temple, although the swindler monk himself gets a cut. So there is a kind of ambiguity about whether this is a good thing. And that kind of evocation of the complex relationships between somebody like, in this case, a wealthy timber merchant who is able to donate 1,000 taels of silver, and the monastics who are running what initially is a poor Buddhist temple, but actually have enough understanding of the world to pull one over the eyes of somebody like this, tells us a lot about Ming society, I think.
I think that's a great story as well. There's another one that in the misrepresentation section, this is type 4, called Gulling People by Impersonating an Envoy from the Netherworld and Burning a Register. And one of the things that's interesting about this story is that you essentially have two types of magician or fortune teller. You have a horoscoper, so somebody who can tell the future, and is already a resident of this fictional town. This is one of the stories that has a fake place name. And so he's already doing his business, and he's like gathered data on the local people. And then a Taoist arrives and essentially chats the guy up and says, "Hey, will you share your information about the locals with me?" And then the Taoist goes on to make predictions, and he has a register. He pretends he's an envoy from the netherworld and that he knows who's going to die, who's fated to die. And he creates a list and then burns half of it, and essentially convinces people that if you're not on the list, you must have been on the burned other half. And if you don't want to die, you have to bribe me so I can take the bribe to hell to keep you from dying. And it's a scheme that really plays on people's psychology and is one of the few where you have this kind of dual level practitioner, one who's presumably moral, another who's completely unscrupulous, just passing through town and trying to skim off some money from gullible people. So that would be my nomination from volume 2.
Yes, very interesting. The publisher sent me volume 2, but I fortunately haven't had time to read it yet. I did read the first one, at least part of it. And the story that I like is similar to the one that Professor Rusk mentioned. It involves the Buddhist monk who said this cow is my mother. And then he tricks the cow over, kills it, and sells it for money. And I really enjoyed the analysis that Zhang Yingyu appends at the end of each story. It's like, oh, like, yeah, he donated the money to the temple, which is good, but pretending the cow was his mother is like the worst thing you can do. Definitely, I think there's, I guess, an ambiguous attitude towards Buddhism in this book. So you mentioned earlier, is the first edition of the book available on Gutenberg? Is that open access?
Yes, so there are actually quite a few copies now that are available freely online. We have a list of those in our bibliography. The copy, which was printed in the Late Ming at the Harvard Yenjing Library, is freely available in a very high quality scan. There are a couple of copies, at least one printed and one handwritten from the Late Ming in Japan that are also available online. And the text has been digitized at Gutenberg, although that digital text is a little bit problematic. There are some issues because it seems to have been initially done in simplified characters and then converted to traditional characters, which inevitably leads to some problems, as well as some typos and some entry errors and some missing passages. So it's not complete, but it's readable, I would say.
Great. I highly encourage people who are interested to read the translation. Again, I just read some of the first volume, but it's actually very entertaining. Get a glimpse of society in this period, the different kind of scams that are going on. And I think it would be kind of also very interesting to compare this to swindle books from other parts of the world during this time. I guess it's human nature to swindle and to scam and to see like where there's overlap. So now that this book's complete, do the two of you have any future projects lined up or is taking a break for now?
I'm just finishing a translation project with Julie Wong, a Taiwanese novel called The Crossing of the Boers. This is an extremely long novel from 2018, 野猪渡河, and it has its own challenges. It's an entirely different work. It's set in Borneo during the Japanese invasion and occupation in the 1940s, as well as the aftermath. And it's kind of a magical realist novel. So it has a lot of modernist flourishes, and it's a different type of thicket, right? The Book of Swindles is a thicket of swindles and moral peril. This other one is kind of a vocabulary thicket that's as layered as all of the underbrush and understory and canopy of the jungle, and has a similar diversity of flora and fauna. So that's one that I've been working on recently.
So I got a couple of things going on, but one that kind of came out of this project is I got very interested in brokers as a profession in the Late Ming. People who would, when a wholesaler, when a trader would come to town, they wouldn't necessarily know who to sell their wares to if they wanted to distribute it on a retail level. And so there were these various intermediaries. And these are people who have to establish trust. They have to be trusted by both the local established businesses, but also visitors. And so they're really interesting as a category of people who make themselves seem trustworthy. They also, in some cases, acted as intermediaries between the world of commerce and the state for certain kinds of procurement and tax collection purposes. And so thinking about how in that context you would become a trustworthy person and develop that reputation and also be held responsible for your actions in a way that was quasi-legal but wasn't simply codified by law is a really interesting case that came out of studying this book.
And brokers is a whole section of the Book of Swindles. There are other sections about, say, corruption and education. We translated all of those for volume 1. But I just want to read very briefly kind of our come on how we frame the second volume at the beginning of our introduction to More Swindles from the Late Ming. And we call that It Gets Worse. Readers of the Book of Swindles selections from a Late Ming collection will remember that the 44 stories in that first volume of translations from Zhang Yingyu's 17th century work present a dim view of society. Well, we've saved the worst for last. Dear reader, are you fond of tales of neighbors betrayed, spouses prostituted, travelers murdered, honest merchants fleeced, promising students corrupted, women of good family debauched, and widows drugged? Do you savor stories about scoundrels who pervert the justice system, break religious vows, hoodwink the faithful, adulterate precious metals, encourage gambling and alcoholism, blind and amputate children, use sorcery to foment insurrection, or rob a fellow with his pants down? If so, this second volume, More Swindles from the Late Ming, Sex, Scams, and Sorcery, is for you.
I think that's a great opening to the introduction. Definitely very provocative and piques people's interest. And this book, again, is available through the publisher, Princeton University Press. Or is it? Columbia University Press, yes. And also on Amazon, I presume, as most books are these days. But definitely very enjoyable read. And thank you both for spending so much time, I guess several years, translating this book so we can have it in English for a wider audience. And thanks to you both again for taking the time to come to the podcast to share more about the book and your experience translating it. Very informative and also entertaining.
Thanks very much, Yiming.
Thank you.
So that concludes our interview. Thank you for listening to the Chinese History Podcast.